Well, guys, we have a number of different topics we can talk about today based on our two guests, Ray and Nick. But why don't we start off and talk a little bit about Bigfoot? How's that? Let's talk about Bigfoot. And I want to just mention a couple of things. And Fred, you're the new director of cryptozoology for the Mutual UFO Network.
Right.
So you can ask Nick any questions you want. But, you know, I came across a couple of things. One was 850 new species discovered in Australia, and they say that's only about 20% of all the species there. So 80% of the species they haven't discovered yet. I came across another article about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and Thomas Jefferson asked them to look for Bigfoot because he knew that the Indians interacted with these creatures and actually traded with them. And then lastly, and Fred, I don't know if you're aware of this, I came across this Foreign Service dispatch from the Air Force. It's from June 22nd, 1959. Yeah, you saw that, right? And it said that there are 3 regulations in Nepal for searching for Yeti. First thing, you got to pay in Indian currency. Second thing was that the Yeti, it can be photographed or caught alive but not killed, and you have to surrender everything to the government of Nepal, and that any sort of news and reports have to go through the government of Nepal first before being released to the world. So I thought that was interesting. So Bigfoot's your area. Ask Nick whatever you want.
Nick, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about the interdimensional Bigfoot. I know you're a firm believer in that. Could you talk about that a little bit, what you believe?
You broke up then, I didn't get any of that.
Yeah, he wanted to know about Bigfoot being interdimensional, what your thoughts are on that, as opposed to a primate here on Earth.
Right, well, yeah, I mean, I don't personally think that... What's that?
No, go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Oh. I don't personally think that Bigfoot is just a North American equivalent of like a gorilla or an orangutan or something like that. I think there's something much stranger about Bigfoot. The fact that we never catch one, they never get hit by cars, we never get conclusive hard evidence. And, you know, yeah, it's true that most people never see a mountain lion in the wild or a bear, but people do see them. People do shoot them successfully and kill them. They do get put in zoos, etc., etc. And it's really only these so-called cryptids, and with Bigfoot kind of at the top of the list, that fall into this category of not just being elusive, but being elusive 100% of the time. Now, if Bigfoot was just some sort of 2-foot tall creature or a 6-inch long insect, I could understand it. But when you're talking about a country as populated and as advanced as the United States is, and we cannot capture or kill even one 7 to 8 foot tall ape-like animal roaming around, there's something wrong. So that kind of leads me to believe that we're dealing with something that's only temporarily in our reality. And I don't just say that because it's a convenient explanation. It's because witnesses these creatures vanishing and reappearing, and you know, those type of cases, although certainly they're in the minimum number of reports compared to just regular sightings, you know, arguably there shouldn't be any reports like that if it's just an unknown ape. So these sort of fringe aspects lead me to believe we're dealing with something, you know, that isn't just an animal.
Okay, why do you think that, like MUFON, when they get a UFO report, they don't want to do nothing with Bigfoot? Or when a BFRO gets a Bigfoot report, they don't want to do nothing with the UFOs. Why do you think that's going on?
Well, I don't think that just relates to certain groups. I think that can relate across the board. It's that, you know, a lot of ufologists take the view that they're dealing with just nuts and bolts phenomenon, aliens coming from another planet, and many cryptozoologists just take the view that they're dealing with unknown animals or animals that might have survived extinction. So when, you know, the cryptozoological field is exposed to UFO stuff, and when the people in the UFO field are exposed to the crypto stuff, a lot of people just don't take it on board because it doesn't sit well in their belief systems. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and Fred, they just made you the head of the crypto, so we finally got MUFON on board to take a look at these type of cases. But Nick, I mean, that's also similar. We'll talk a little bit later about Men in Black, but that whole phenomena that you just described with Bigfoot being there, not being there, being physical, being interdimensional, I mean, it's similar to the Men in Black, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the weird things about the Men in Black is that they seem to have this uncanny ability that, when they turn up at somebody's doorstep, it's almost as if they literally manifested at the doorstep, and when they leave, they literally leave in terms of just dematerializing. And the reports, for example, of Men in Black arriving at somebody's doorstep in deep snow, and there's no tracks on the ground. Footprints on the ground, I should say. You get similar reports like that leave. That there's no evidence in the mud or in the snow or anything like that. Reports of Men in Black turning up in the rain, and when they walk in the house, they're completely dry. So, like Bigfoot, it's like here 1 second, gone the next second.
Yeah, it's Nick, we live on this kind of haunted interdimensional planet where we and the scientific community, everything has to be explainable and physical, but yet there's this other thing that's going on, and there's this cognitive dissonance out there that people refuse to see it. Like you said, the UFO group is not interested in ghosts, demons, and Bigfoot. The Bigfoot researchers don't care or want to believe in UFOs. The ghost people, same thing. There's like this dissonance where they don't want to, they shut their mind down when it doesn't fit what they want to talk about.
Well, that's true, but I don't think that's something that's just, typical of Bigfoot or UFO researchers. I mean, if you look at religion, there are numerous worldwide religions. Some teach that there's reincarnation. Others teach that, there's life after death in the terms of a soul. Some religions teach that only humans have souls. Other religions teach that every living creature has a soul or a life force. So, this has actually nothing to do with people who investigate Bigfoot or UFOs. This is actually an example of human nature, that we can't agree on things in pretty much any situation, Yeah,
I agree with you, Nick, because, I think a lot of it has to do with protecting the field you're in, and you see it in the scientific community, et cetera. If you want a grant, you got to believe certain things. So they don't want to step outside it, because then you're changing what you just spent thousands of dollars to go to college for in a lot of cases, and you got to stay in line. Now, Nick, you've written 36 books. How long have you been writing?
About 25 years, something like that.
That's amazing. What was the first book that you wrote?
First one was called A Covert Agenda, which came out in '97. And although I've been writing sort of freelance stuff and for magazines, like I said, 4 or 5 years before that, and Covert Agenda is a study of the early files that the British government released on UFOs back in the early 1990s. And there's a lot of good reports, pilot encounters, radar reports, police sightings, things like this. And nobody had really done anything with these files. This was pre-internet era, so you had to go down to the National Archives just outside of London and go through, mountains of old material trying to find stuff. It's not like today, where the National Archives has a website and you can download all the files as PDF. This was when you had to sort of put your boots on, so to speak, and get out there and do the research. And so that was basically the thrust of the first book, was looking at these early files.
And what got you into this whole field? How did you get started?
Well, my dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He worked as a radar mechanic, and in the 1950s he was involved in several UFO incidents at the height of a NATO exercise called Mainbrace, where the radar operators were tracking these high-flying, fast-moving objects on the scopes. And as a radar mechanic, my dad was brought in to check if there were any issues with the machines themselves, if they were creating false readings. And it turns out they weren't. And then when pilots were sent up to try and intercept them, the pilots reported seeing these bright lights in the sky, doing all sorts of weird maneuvers. And then they started getting reports from up and down the East Coast at different radar bases as well. And everybody was told not to talk about this, reminded that they'd signed the British government's Official Secrets Act. And my dad didn't tell anybody. He kept silent until I was about 11, 12, something like that. And then he told me the story, and that's really what got me interested in it all.
That's interesting. Now, you live in Texas, but where are you originally from? Where's the accent?
Well, I grew up just outside the city of Lichfield in central England, but probably the most well-known city, which was about 20 miles from where I grew up, was the city of Birmingham, which is about 120 miles north of London. So if you just look at London on a map, go north for 120 miles, you'll see Birmingham. Go a little bit further, you'll see Lichfield, and that's where I was from.
Okay, I just got back from Scotland 2 weeks ago. Now, it seems like every time we put a UFO show on, you see the two Nicks. It's either Nick Pope or Nick Redfern on one of these shows. So I'm going to have to pick up that British accent in order to get on some shows again, you know. But Nick, you just completed our circuit, which is the 3 conferences we do: Erie, Pittsburgh, Philly. I know you had some flight issues getting out of Erie, but
Yeah.
I know it's unbelievable. But you know, how does our 3 conferences compare to some of the other ones you do on the West Coast? You know, it seems like the MUFON people never get invited as speakers to the West Coast conferences, so we do our own. But how does our conference compare, and which of the 3 did you like the best?
Well, I would say I probably enjoyed the latest one, you know, the one we just did, mainly because, you know, what I enjoy about the conference and all the conferences you've put on is that, you know, you're open-minded on the phenomenon. You're not trying to push a particular agenda, and you got a lot of different people talking about different things. One of the things I find in a lot of the organized conferences is that they very much want you to sort of toe the line, which is why I don't get booked to speak at a lot of mainstream conferences, you know, the big recognized group conferences. You know, you don't actually see me talking at their annual conferences very much, because I don't really toe the line. You know, I have a lot of alternative views on cryptozoology and ufology, and a lot of conference organizers don't want that. They think that the nuts and bolts angle is going to bring the punters in, and so that's what they want. And you know, if you're not saying it, well, you know, I'm not going to change my approach or my views just to kiss somebody's ass, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just going to tell as I see it, and if people don't like it, well, they can book somebody else for the conference. I don't care.
Yeah. You know, Nick, we get, you know, we've had ghost people on, Bigfoot. We did a joint 2-day conference, 1 day UFOs, 1 day Bigfoot. Yeah, it's like, you know, the whole thing's unexplained, and I think it all has something to do with everything, you know, no matter what field you're investigating. And I thought one of the best things we did was the Friday night before Erie. The 6 or 7 of us sat down, the speakers, and we had a round table. Were you there, Fred, for the round table? No, you came the next day. We had a round table on trying to figure out this UFO thing and demonology because of really a demonic attack on me around Thanksgiving, which is what it clearly was. And that was like the best part. I wish we could have filmed it or put a couple of chairs on the stage and done that in front of the audience. They would have loved it, because it was so natural trying to figure this thing out, you know. And Nick, the one thing you told me, which, you know, is not to try to find one reason for the whole thing, but my whole life I'm striving for the string theory of the unknown, to explain it all. There's got to be one thing, and that's what I'm after.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree with you there. It's, you know, if you're going to look at the UFO subject in sort of like a closed room situation and not look at the other issues that are going on, you're not going to see the full picture. I mean, I think people like John Keel in particular noted that, the idea that so many of these things are interconnected. You know, why do people see Bigfoot at the same time that they see weird lights in the woods? You know, how can Bigfoot dematerialize? How is it that in some UFO cases, you know, there seems to be overtones that go beyond just nuts and bolts UFOs and aliens, like synchronicities. You know, how can the presence of just an unknown craft from another world provoke synchronicities in the witness? You know, so there's clearly something else going on. But I mean, you know, I think one of the problems is in terms of how these things have been labeled. You know, whether it's UFOs, people automatically think of alien spacecraft. Bigfoot, they think of a giant ape. You talk about demons, they think of, you know, a creature with horns and a forked tail and some fiery pit. You know, it's just like very simplistic imagery that people have based around cultural perception. So I think we sort of need to kind of look totally out the box to try and get answers to all of these things. You know, I mean, I don't personally, we talked about the demonic thing, you know, I don't personally think there's a literal hell filled with demons, but do I think there are multiple realms of existence where things which have been perceived as demons could come through and really don't like us and cause havoc in our lives? Yeah, I do think that happens, but that doesn't mean, from my perspective at least, that, you know, that they're under the control of Satan, and, you know, and he's got this, like I said, pitchfork and hates the human race. That to me comes across like a fairy story, you know, fairy tale.
Yeah, and you know, we label things so we understand them, but there is clearly malevolent interdimensional entities, and maybe that's the better word and not say demons, because there are malevolent interdimensional entities, and there are also guardian ones that look out for us. So hey Fred, let's move over now a little bit into Ray and his background, and then we'll get into Ray Barker, Albert Bender, and the men and women in black. So again, introduce Ray and ask him a few questions.
Okay, Ray is a professor at West Virginia University, and current professor, and he's a PhD. He also started into UFOs in 1967. He was the founder and director of Outer Space International Research and Investigation Society of Hillmore, California, as well as the publisher and co-editor of New Militia Star, a monthly tabloid newspaper with circulation of 7,500 people, which was really good.
Yeah.
He received his doctoral degree in West Virginia University in 2011, and now he works on UFOs most of his life here. He talks about UFOs and all about them. And with that, here's Mr. Cosmos Ray Keller.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Brad, for that introduction and your kind words. Yes, I've been investigating UFOs since 1967, and recently, while I was in the Gray Barker files, I happened to come across an article about me that appeared in the National Enquirer in 1969, and it detailed my first encounter with a flying saucer on a campout. Here's a bigger picture of it, and then the actual.
You look a little bit different, right?
Yeah,
40-something years ago.
yeah, add 49 years in stir. So I began to write articles for my local hometown newspaper, the Bedford Times-Register. I investigated UFOs with Earl J. Neff, the director of the Cleveland Ufology Project, and he was also one of the original team with Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. He was a sketch artist. And so it was a privilege to grow up in that background. Then we had moved to California.
Excuse me, Bedford, Ohio.
Bedford, Ohio, yeah.
Oh,
They know where you're talking
Bedford,
about.
Ohio. Bedford Bearcats. Go Bearcats. And then moved out to California and became acquainted with the contactee community out there. If you don't know, the contactees are a little bit different than the abductees. The contactees claim to have friendly communications with extraterrestrial and or ultradimensional entities. So they're they're a little bit different. They weren't involuntarily recruited, but they were more or less chosen. And I became good friends with Gabriel Green, and a member of Amalgamated Flying Saucer Clubs of America, and APRO, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. There was Coral and Jim Lorenzen's group.
Do you know that Robert Kennedy was a card-carrying member of the Amalgamated Flying Saucer group?
Yes.
He was a card-carrying member of that group, Bobby Kennedy.
When I was at Gabe's house in Yucca Valley, he showed me Bobby Kennedy's card and his membership thing.
No, it's an amazing time because, you know, you had... I lost the name now of the guy who ran for president, the congressman, the senator from New York. It's eluding me right now. But you had all these people that were members of UFO organizations.
Oh, yeah,
you know, you had people, the founder of the CIA was also on the board of NICAP, you know, maybe for good reasons. but you know, it's amazing that, you know, it's so different than today. We think we've become progressive and open-minded and all. We haven't. We've gone the opposite direction.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'd like to share something.
Yeah.
George Fawcett was a North Carolina director of the Mutual UFO Network, and I did a lot of work with him in the Carolinas. Here's an article that we put together. It's 3 full pages. It was in the Orangeburg Times-Democrat on the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash. But George Fawcett was very open-minded to other paranormal phenomena and other aspects of ufology, and this is something that George Fawcett wrote. Now this goes, John, to what you were just saying. This was written in August 1955 by George Fawcett in his own, he just typed this, and it never got published, but I'd like to read some of the things in here because it's so apropos to what we're talking about today. He says, during the study of the saucer phenomena, I ran into many other unusual phenomena, some which could possibly be related someday. Now this was August 1955. He said, he hoped that future science would someday be able to explain some of this along with the saucer phenomena. So he believed that they were intimately tied in together. And he lists 14 items here. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time to go through these, not too much time. Number 1, the appearance of strange creatures on the face of the earth, along with the abominable snowman of the Himalayan mountains. Fred, there's the Yeti connection right there. And I have a friend that helps me with my website, VenusConciseHistory.com, Chrisana Duran. She's a Native American, a full-blooded Cherokee. She's in Missoula, Montana. And she wrote a book called Our Bigfoot Star Ancestors, and ties in many of the Bigfoot sightings to an extraterrestrial, ultra-dimensional creature very similar to the Wookiee on the Star Wars.
Well, hit the 2 or 3 best ones because we can't go over all 14.
All right, 2, mysterious footprints and markings on the face of the earth. 3, disappearance of people, ships, and planes. Number 4, glass pox, better known as cracked windshield mystery. Number 5, burrowing garden hose phenomena. Number 6, the appearance of strange sea monsters, sea creatures. Number 7, bleeding and weeping religious statues. And I uncovered a lot of strange things with that, and if we have time I'll be able to cover it a little before the program's out, because it's really a blockbuster news. And number 8, falling substances from the skies, ore, wood, wheat, honey, fish, blood, stones, meat, frogs, metal, that Fortiana stuff.
You know what I read about that when frogs and fish and everything fall from the sky? It's that the UFOs are kind of cloaked, and that what they do is they scoop out in the ocean. Let's say they want sharks, they want because they have zoos and they have museums. So they scoop them up, and what they do when they're flying past, they get rid of everything else. Just like if you're fishing for tuna, you know, then you get all these other little fish, they drop them. So what happens is you have all these fish landing on, and people say, where are they coming from? You know, it's them getting rid of the stuff they don't want. But hey, let's talk about, instead of going through all of those, Fawcett's repetitions. Are you familiar with what he wrote? I don't know when he wrote it in the 70s, called Fawcett's repetitions. it's when there's a UFO encounter, like trace evidence, there are 25 things that show up on a UFO CE3, let's say. Are you familiar with that at all?
Oh yes, he did work a lot with that classification system,
Yeah.
and I believe that his daughter still maintains all his files. I don't think they've been turned over to anyone yet.
Okay. Well, you know what? I came across that just a few years ago. I didn't know about it. I was reading a book, and there it was. And what do you think number 8 is on the list? The appearance of boron. Now, do you remember the case in Bucks County with Denise, with the metallic sprinkles in the tree? When we analyzed the leaves, there was high levels of boron on the leaves, just the tree that the probes went into. So I said, you know, here it is. Here's something written in 1975 of what shows up, boron, and what do we find? Boron. And I didn't know it at the time. It was probably 2013 that I came across that as far as... So Fred, ask him about his book here. What is this book about that he's got?
Well, you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure.
I listened to one of his presentations.
Yeah.
Okay. And matter of fact, I listened to 2 of them, and they're very good presentations. He talks about early UFOs, and one good thing, one of the best things I liked about it was the eve of destruction. He talks about the eve of destruction, and he also plays the record in there and shows the video, which is very interesting.
Cool song.
Well, interestingly enough, in June 1947, when the age of flying saucers began with Kenneth Arnold's sighting of 9 disc-shaped objects over Mount Rainier in Washington State, the Doomsday Clock was instituted at the University of Chicago. And this was taking into various factors, nuclear buildup, radiation dispersal in the atmosphere, and so forth, and placing the doomsday at the start of the Cold War at about 5 minutes to midnight. And then every year they reset the doomsday clock. But the book looks at the appearance of flying saucers in greater numbers beginning in the 1950s, and accounts of Venusians that live among us. So it's a very serious book, and it's well documented. Over 600 footnotes, over 100 photographs and illustrations, many in color. And the book's already won some awards, wildcard category at the London Festival of Books and Southern California Book Festival in Hollywood. So it is available on Amazon.com. Venus Rising, A Concise History of the Second Planet.
When did you write it? What year? How old is it?
Keller. It's came out less than a year ago.
Oh, okay. All right, very good.
And but one thing that George Fawcett believed was a factor for the simultaneous appearance of paranormal phenomena along with ufology was the nuclear testing and dispersal of radiation, together with various experiments in subatomic particles in Brookhaven in New York, as well as in Italy and other parts of the world, where it was announced in the early 1950s, mid 1950s, that particles that were traveling faster than light actually passed through the Earth from Brookhaven to Italy, and he believed that this had something to do, together with the nuclear testing by the United States, the Soviet Union, and France for the appearance of this phenomena, that it opened up some kind of rift in the space-time continuum. So that's why George Fawcett, he quoted, he was a very religious person, and he believed that it tied in with the end days, the latter days. St. Luke chapter 21, verses 25 through 27, that said there would be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and great distress upon the nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Men's hearts will fail them for fear, and they will look after these things which are coming on the earth, for the very powers of heaven shall be shaken. So when we look at George Adamski, Howard Menger, these other contactees, and we look very closely at the message that they were bringing us, we see that all of this stuff does indeed tie in. And could explore more about it in my book, as well as connections to magic realism and other aspects of the paranormal.
Okay, let's roll into, we're sticking with West Virginia here, but let's roll into Albert Bender, Gray Barker, and Nick. I want you to join in, obviously, here. But I had read, and we talked about this at an earlier show. I read Gray Barker's book. They knew too much about flying saucers, and I guess it turns out that Gray Barker was the chief investigator for Albert Bender's group that he had started up. And I didn't know that Albert Bender, I think that was 1956, and then in I think 62 or 63, Albert Bender finally wrote a book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. The three men being the Men in Black. Right. So he waited before he actually published, because he left Gray Barker hanging about this mystery, but it started the Men in Black, phenomenon. And let me just tell you a few things about Albert Bender. Barker believed that what Bender was talking about was really demonic. It was definitely paranormal as opposed to physical. And he started the Men in Black craze. Bender started the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1952, and he also started the Space Review magazine. And they had thousands of members all around the world. That's how he met his wife from England. It's through the magazine and his group. She became a member. He said he knew the truth about flying saucers. He was going to publish it in October of *53, and instead he shuts down the Bureau and the magazine. And he never tells anybody what happened, but what did happen was he was visited by three Men in Black who he described as having ghoulish, shiny eyes. They communicated telepathically. They confirmed the truth to him about UFOs. And there was always a smell of sulfur when they showed up. See, to me, that's key, that any time they showed up, there was this strong smell of sulfur. Bender waited 9 years before publishing his book, and he leaves a warning at the end of the book that those engaged in flying saucer work, be careful. Now, Bender also, his attic was full of all kinds of occult, paranormal objects. He referred to it as the Chamber of Horrors. So you see this paranormal, demonic connection to Bender, but Bender started the Men in Black phenomenon. And Nick, I'll turn it over to you, because I'm not an expert in the Men in Black or the Women in Black, which is something I didn't think of until you just wrote the book. So tell us a little bit more about the Men in Black and the Women in Black and what we don't know.
Well, I think certainly for the general public, a lot of their views on the whole subject. Hello?
Yeah, good. I hear you.
I think as far as the general public's concerned, at least, when it comes to the Men in Black particularly, and the Women in Black also, most people's perceptions are sort of driven by the movies, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. And so they have this image that the Men in Black are, in simple terms, secret agents, something along those lines, which actually isn't the case. Most of the reports I get, there's always at least one sort of weird aspect to it, whether it's the person's appearance, you know, they look at really pale skin, bulging eyes, or some sort of paranormal activity in the home after the men in black or the women in black have left, like poltergeist activity. I've got a few cases like that. So we're clearly dealing with something that, like Bender found out to his cost, something that, in some people's eyes at least, you know, harks back to the idea of G-men and government agents and secret agents, but actually doesn't. You know, if you look at the reports, the vast majority of the reports, they fall into a very different category. And I think certainly Bender was a victim. He was not just a victim of the Men in Black, he was a victim of his own character, in the sense that I think that if you have sort of low self-esteem, you're not a self-assured person or a strong character, these things will get their grips into. And I think that happened with Bender. I mean, by his own admission, you know, he lived an unusual life. He only died a couple of months ago. He was like 94.
Yeah, he just passed away this year.
Yeah, but he was somebody who, you know, if you read his book, he talks about how he developed this fear of cancer. So he was like a hypochondriac. On top of that, he would get annoyed if people would come over and anything in his office had been moved, even like a pen, you know, and he would notice, he'd be able to tell if it was in the wrong place or at the wrong angle, which is like a classical example of like obsessive compulsive disorder, you know, when everything's got to be in its place, and if it's not, you know, people freak out. He had that as well. So he was a very complex person, and I think somebody showing those traits potentially opens themselves up. And of course, there's the fact that Bender wasn't a dabbler in the occult, he was an expert. You know, he was very sort of well learned and educated in the field of the occult. And of course, if you're going to start dabbling in the occult and opening doors, well, you know, don't blame anybody else if something comes through. And I think that's what happened with Bender, that something came through and manifested in an imagery that was sort of really frightening to him, like the idea of these ghoulish, pale-faced, shining eyes men in black, you know, looks like a cross between government agents and vampires, you know, and and it really did sort of give birth to the mystery. And of course, you know, since then we've had who knows how many Men in Black reports. I mean, I've got hundreds, Tim Beckley's got hundreds, you know, Keel, if you read Mothman Prophecies, you have numerous reports. And then of course there's the reports that people probably haven't spoken about. So, you know, it's definitely a big phenomenon, but it's nothing to do with the Pentagon or the NSA or anything like that at all.
Yeah. Now, Bender did go on and become very accomplished. He started a society for, I can't think of who the composer was, but it was actually a big
Max Steiner.
Yeah, Max Steiner Society. So he was an accomplished person. One of the things, though, Nick, that I look for now that I studied demonology the last 2 years is I now see in a lot of the older cases where people start talking about that smell of sulfur. And to me, in my mind, that smell of sulfur is a key that maybe you're not dealing with extraterrestrials, unless maybe their planet is sulfur-based. But you know, maybe you're dealing with something interdimensional here, something that we would call demonic. I prefer to say fallen, you know, fallen angel. But you know, you see that with the Men in Black. You see it with the Flatwoods creatures. Do you remember the Flatwoods in West Virginia? They saw this thing that was floating off the ground with a red face. It was hooded, right? I think it had bright, I don't know what kind of eyes, I can't remember the description. It was red-faced, and it had a strong sulfur smell. So now I say to myself, was the Flatwoods case this interdimensional malevolent entity, or was it really, you know, there was a UFO that came down. What was it? And the Bender case with the sulfur. When I hear sulfur, to me now that's a key. You're dealing with something else. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I got into all this as a kid, and it was all very much black and white, you know, nuts and bolts UFOs, Bigfoot's an ape, all this. And then you start to find that there are these weird crossovers and connections. So But I mean, I'll be the first to admit that when we're sort of talking about multi-dimensions and extra dimensions, you know, we need to be able to confirm that these places or realms do exist. Now, things like quantum physics are allowing for multiple dimensions, and so, you know, I think we're getting closer to the truth of what these things are. But, you know, in terms of the UFO community, there's a lot of resistance, whether conscious or not, to stay in the so-called good old days of like Donald Kehoe, when it was, you know, the UFO researchers against the Air Force, and it's all, you know, metal ships coming from somebody else's equivalent of NASA. But for me, if you avoid or ignore the weirder overtones, you're missing part of the story. So, you know, we have to look into all this. You know, we can't just ignore it and say, well, it doesn't fit into my paradigm or my ideas or anything like that. You know, we have to look at it from the perspective that these things are interconnected, but also not just interconnected, but it's suggestive that they're not what we think they are. You know, we think they're extraterrestrials, we think they're unknown animals. They're not. There's something much stranger going on than that.
Now, do you think that the Air Force jumped on the Men in Black bandwagon? Because I remember going through the MUFON archives, because I write that monthly article for MUFON just like you do, and there was a quote in there by James Oberg, who said that the Air Force would routinely put suits on, and so you wouldn't know they were from the Air Force, and they would kind of pose as NASA people or people in suits. And I said to myself, well, there you go. Here are some of the cases of the Men in Black. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've actually heard of quite a few stories like that, and I think that is part of the mystery. And it actually adds to the mystery, because you have this other layer where the real Men in Black, whose origins we still don't fully understand, and then you've got somebody in the official world saying, well, hang on, you know, if we really want to silence people, why don't we dress up like those Men in Black? We might not know who they are, but if we mimic them, it's still going to have the same effect of silencing the witnesses. So then you're faced with this really weird situation of having two categories of the Men in Black. The really weird ones and somebody who's pretending to be the really weird ones. Yeah, and of course, you could have legitimate cases where, you know, say for example in the early 50s, the FBI may have gone out and interviewed, you know, various people in the UFO field, but back then the guys wore, you know, black suits and fedora hats. That was the normal fashion. So some of those reports, entirely innocent, could over the years have been sort of interpreted as a Man in Black case as well.
I got a question, Nick. Out of all the cases you studied, Men in Black, of course, when they come, they threaten you and this and that. Have you ever heard of any of them actually hurting anybody?
No, I actually haven't. It's mainly just down to the threat. And they're very good at making threats and sort of veiled allusions to, you know, if you talk about this, you'll die, or, you know, something will happen to your car, that kind of thing. They kind of infer the threat and let you put the threads together. And typically that works because the threat itself is menacing, and they look weird and menacing themselves. You know, they don't look like regular people. So that usually is enough to silence people. And I mean, I get cases, for example, where people have seen the Men in Black back in the 60s or the 70s. In one case, in the 40s, where they'd stayed silent for years, and they only spoke out decades later because they were fearful that if they started talking about it, it would sort of open the door again. So these threats actually work really well. You know, they don't need to go to the full extent of taking somebody out of circulation, which would probably bring more attention to it if they did, you know. So but yeah, the threat usually does the job. Yeah,
and then, you know, the Air Force threatened people too. If you look at Roswell, you know, those witnesses were told that, you know, that the desert's a big place. We'll bury you out there and they'll never find you. So you know, that happens. But you know what's weird too, Nick, is that the reports on the Men in Black started to change to tan-skinned, Cuban-looking. Maybe when the missile crisis and stuff started, that they became tan-skinned looking people with the sunglasses, or they had Asian type eyes and features. So it seemed to evolve and change, and maybe that's the introduction of the government agents along with these real kind of interdimensional agents.
Yeah, but if you look at the occupants of UFOs, back in the days they had fairies. You know, they had the little people. You know, they had little animals running around. I don't know. I think it changes as we go on.
Yeah, but see, that's the weird thing, you know, about this whole field. And I don't know if you want to comment on this. It changes with the culture it's dealing with.
Right.
With, you know, with Italy, theirs are different. With South America, theirs are different.
Right.
You know, there are things seen in the United States that are not seen in Brazil. There's things seen in Brazil. It kind of adapts to your culture, and I find that odd, you know, unless they're just very intelligent. What do you think about that, Ray?
Well, yes, this is the way that some extraterrestrials and or ultra-dimensionals communicate through symbols. And a lot of times when we look at their technology, we only perceive it as magic, just because we haven't attained that level where we could comprehend or duplicate it. It's interesting when we go back in history, though, and you look at Emanuel Swedenborg and Dante and others who wrote about traveling to Venus, for example. Their stories are very similar, and they pass through realms of light and the transition into a new kind of world. But it's physical when they get there. Although they're aware that somehow something is different. Even Adamski wrote about that at the end of Inside the Spaceships. He said he wasn't sure exactly if he was in another dimension or not. That it was kind of a borderline area. He felt like everything was real, but he wasn't sure. It's maybe like a holodeck on, you know, like on Star Trek. But yes, it's a very nebulous area, and well, Mark Probert and others, Borderland Sciences Research Association, began to look at this in 1946, and they came to the conclusion that yes. The UFO phenomena are flying, I call it flying saucers because it's not unidentified. We know that there's something there. And that it's both ultra-dimensional and extraterrestrial, because even we have components of ultra-dimensionality. We have 5 senses that we're aware of, but we may have 20 or 30 that we just haven't developed, that they're latent within us, like the Theosophists say.
We got to let's transfer. We got a couple other things we got to talk about. You know, I think about Mothman. You know, and you're West Virginia guys, both of you, right? So you got this white or gray man-sized bird with red eyes. What is that? You know, and you think about the sulfur smell with you know, with some of these cases. And Nick, you know, I came across this on Black-Eyed Kids. I'm sure you probably wrote a book on this too. But, you know, Black-Eyed Kids, first reported by journalist Brian Bethel on January 16th, 1998. And he goes into a number of different cases, which are really interesting, how they come to your door, and you have to let them in for them to do whatever they do. And anybody that's ever reported them has not let them in. There hasn't been a report from anybody that let them in, so I think that tells you something as to what happens to you when you do let them in.
We just got a report of older black-eyed people up in Jamalsville.
Okay.
A guy, his girlfriend, and his son was walking up to the cross, and there was a guy and a woman standing there looking at the thing with the writing on it about it. And he told the guy, he says, "How you doing?" He said the guy looked up, and the guy's eyes were just all black. And the guy hurried up and put his head back down again.
But you know, the whole fact that you have to invite them in, again, this is what you hear with you know, vampires, with demonic entities, that there has to be an invitation to let them in. Well, briefly, Nick, what do you think about the Black-Eyed Kids?
Well, I think it's all sort of part and parcel of the Men in Black mystery, the Women in Black, and it's tied in with things like the Hat Man and the Shadow People, things like this. And yeah, I think, you know, you can find deep parallels between the black-eyed children and the men in black. You know, the men in black wait to be invited in. They don't force their way into people's homes. You know, the black-eyed children usually wear black hoodies. The men in black wear black suits, you know, so, and they've got the fedora hat, and the kids have got like the hoodie. So there's like a hat or a head cover component as well. Very often the skin looks similar, sort of very pale or just not sort of even real. Some people describe it as almost like having a plastic type effect. So whatever these things are, I think they're all interconnected, and like you say, they rely upon the invitation to allow them to sort of come into your world. And I think that happened with Ventre. He was looking so deeply for the UFO answers that he said, well, I'll do whatever I've got to do to get the answers, and that effectively opened the door. You know, they said, well, you know, to provide the answers.
All right, let's segue a little bit into Aleister Crowley and the Collins elite. We've talked about that on the show, but we got you here now. But, you know, I took a look at 1918, interestingly, Nick. And, you know, Crowley, that was the year he conjured up Lamb, which was an elemental being, and it was a gray alien. So in 1918, the Thule Society was also formed. That's the one that Hitler had joined. You know, an occult society. You had the third prophecy of Fatima, 1918. It started in 17, but I guess that third prophecy came out in 18. And the Pope actually is going to visit, go back to Fatima in either 2017 or 18. You had the Spanish flu, killed over 50 million people. People question whether that came in from space. Maybe had something to do with the prophecy of Fatima. And we also had the largest U.S. naval vessel ever to disappear, the USS Cyclops, with 306 crew members. And the German records show they did not sink that ship, and that was in the Bermuda Triangle. So that's, you know, I like to look at things that happened around that same time period. But Dick, tell us a little bit about this Aleister Crowley and how that went into this Collins elite, which to me is a little known secret but hugely important. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, the Collins elite was this group that I was sort of set on the trail of when I interviewed a guy named Ray Boucher. Ray Boucher has an interesting background. He lives in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was a former state director for MUFON back in the 1980s, but he's also a priest. And he takes the view that the UFO phenomenon is sort of literally demonic. And he was approached and met with two physicists who were working on a highly classified Department of Defense program looking at the UFO subject, what they called NHEs, or non-human entities. They believed initially that they were dealing with extraterrestrials. It was done in sort of like a remote viewing mind-to-mind situation with these entities, and over time people on the project got sick, and bad luck and all sorts of weird stuff happened. And they came to believe that these entities, these NHEs, were actually deceptive demonic entities, and they wanted Ray's help in how to combat it, because he had a background in religion and also a background in ufology. So what happened was that he told me this and shared all the information with me. He allowed me to sort of get on the trail of this particular group that uses the nickname. I don't know what I'm pretty sure there's a classified real name, but they use the nickname of the Collins elite to talk about themselves, or possibly even more likely if they're talking with other people who weren't classified or didn't have the classification, I should say, then those people would never get to know the real name of the group. But essentially they were looking at things like the Crowley issue and Lamb, and the paranormal and supernatural overtones in ufology, and things like the Albert Bender story as well. People who'd had developed illnesses and runs of bad luck after a UFO encounter, and how they felt the phenomenon was manipulating people. And so that was basically the thrust of it. It was, as I point out in the book, you know, one of the things it's important to remember is that by their own admission, they didn't have any proof of this. It was all very much belief driven. You know, they believed that the phenomenon was demonic rather than extraterrestrial, which, you know, I think the phenomenon is highly unlikely to be just extraterrestrial. But, you know, I try not to get caught up in belief systems, because if you're forced to believe in something, that means you don't have evidence. Now, I don't need to believe in the existence of Germany or France. They can prove as countries they exist. The Collins elite couldn't prove that what they were dealing with was demonic, so they resorted to belief systems to explain what was going on. There's nothing wrong with doing that, providing you admit that your conclusions are believed based around belief, which is what they do.
Yeah. Now, they're still around today, right? And they thought that the September 11th was the start of the end of days. Is that correct?
Well, again, that's what they believed, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, you can look at end of days stuff forever and a day. I mean, you know, it was all going to happen at the end of the 20th century. All our equipment was going to, you know, stop working because of this 00 issue with computers, etc. You know, you can make a case about end of days stuff throughout history, and it never happened. You know, the 2012 thing, people were getting ready to bury themselves in bunkers. Well, 2012 was years ago. The unfortunate thing is that in life things happen, and if bad things happen, people look for an explanation as to why it happened, when sometimes it just happens because it's bad luck, you know.
Yeah, okay. Hey, we're about out of time. Ray, any last word, real quick comment? Because we're about out of time here.
Oh, yes. Well, as long as we're talking about demons, there's also the angel connection. And Billy Graham, in his book, Messengers of God, the angels, he equated with flying saucers and extraterrestrials.
There's a connection with all of this. So again, time flies. Nick, I'll talk to you on Live Paranormal at the end of the month, a new radio show that I do once a month. And I'll say to the public, something I say on the radio show now is, it's okay to be curious, just don't be obsessive. And only through the eyes of death will you know the truth.